Hey, what's up, bookworms? We're back with another author interview. This time today, it is the best-selling author of the Green Bone Saga and EXO, four-time Aurora Award winner, a Locust winner, a Hugo nominee, Miss Fonda Lee. How are you this evening or
I'm
morning or
well.
afternoon?
I'm doing good.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on, Mike.
Very excited to do this because Green Bone Saga was something that I was interested in when it first came out, and it just kind of got buried when it first happened. And it seemed like everyone on BookTube was talking about it except for me, so I felt really late to the party. And the next thing I knew, book two was out. And I was like, "Dang, I got to get to that." And then I did the thing that I don't like to do and say, "I'll just wait for it to be done." But I was talking to another booktuber, Jake Bishop, who was very, very high on your series, and he basically gave me a sales pitch and gave me a guarantee. Mike, I know you love The Godfather. This is going to be something that I think that you like a lot. And so I did read it, and I did really, really enjoy it. Read it over June, July, and August. It was really nice being able to do that. I know that probably I kept buying them as they kept coming out, so I felt like, okay, I'm not going to upset an author too much by buying their book and telling them, hey, I'm just going to wait till it's done. Does that bother you when people say I'm going to wait till it's done before I read it? Does that bother you?
I'm of two minds on it. As an author, of course,
Yeah.
I want people to buy it once it's out, right? Because oftentimes, if a first book doesn't get enough support, you may
Mm,
not get the next books
exactly.
in the series. So, of course, there's my author hat. But as a reader, I completely understand. I'm also one of those readers who tends to want to wait until the series is done. I know that it will be done
Mm.
and that I can enjoy it all in one go. So I completely sympathize with those who are just getting into the series now. I'm glad you're here joining the party. There's no such thing as late to the party when it comes to books. But I'm also extremely appreciative of people who are first to the bandwagon and make sure the book gets support so that it can actually be completed.
Right. The biggest champion that you have out there, I'm sure you know, is Patrick Leo. And Patrick was really in my messages all the time. Why are you reading that? I told you to read this. So he said to tell you hi. And
Hi,
yeah, he is
Patrick.
definitely a big, big champion of yours. And yes, Patrick, again, you win this round because it was very, very good. So I have a question that I'd like to ask, and I'm going to kind of get into some of these viewer questions here. Before I do that, I want to start this off by saying, guys, Hilo did nothing wrong, and if you want to fight about this, I'll offer you a clean blade right now. So I'm just gonna get that off my chest, okay? I love The Godfather. I think it's one of the greatest movies ever made. It's definitely one of my favorites ever. Should I assume that you agree with this?
I think that's a pretty safe assumption.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, if someone sold me on this series as it's The Godfather with magic, I think I probably would have read it a lot earlier because when I started reading, I was kind of I guess caught off guard because I just assumed it was just, more fantasy. I was expecting swords and shields and, like ancient feudal Japan or something kind of was what I was expecting. So when I'm like, wait, he's like strangling him with a phone cord? I'm like, what's going on here? So it was very, very different for me than what I was expecting, but I think it was for the best ways. So how would you say The Godfather obviously influenced you to really to get around to writing this? How much did it have an influence on the series?
Yeah, so no big surprise. The Godfather is one of my favorite films of all time. And what really hits for me with The Godfather is not that it's not just that it's a gangster story. There's tons of gangster movies out there, right? And I'm a big fan of that genre. Goodfellas, Scarface, anything by Scorsese, good, Untouchables, you name it. But The Godfather, for me, stands head and shoulders above all of those because it's not just a story about gangsters; it's about a family. They happen to be gangsters,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that their lifestyle impacts all of their interpersonal relationships and vice versa is the thing that has always just kept that piece of fiction so forefront of mind for me because especially as you head from like Godfather to Godfather Part Two, just the mastery of kind of telling this intergenerational saga of Vito Corleone and then him coming to America and the handoff to Michael Corleone and then his children. That is it's always just had a place in my heart. So obviously, The Godfather was a big influence for me with this story because it's a fantasy story. It's got lots of clan warfare. It's got martial arts. It's got magic rocks. But at the core, for me, it's a family story. And obviously, there was many other influences that came into the writing of this series because I'm also a big fan of crime drama from the East. So that Hong Kong cinema tradition of the Johnny To films, the John Woo Chow Yun Fat films, and the wuxia genre and all like the martial arts cinema and fiction and those kind of martial hero fantasy stories, that all came into this as well. So this was a series that is, as you can tell, very heavily influenced by my love for The Godfather, but all these other things too, all smashed together.
Yeah, yes, that's why people ask me, Mike, you ever thought about writing? I say, no, it would just be me copying Lord of the Rings and Dune, and that's just not any fun for anybody. Other people are much better at hiding those things. Me, I just be like, hey, it's just beat for beat, just like it. But when I was reading this, the first book especially, I was comparing O'Shea kind of makes me think of like Michael, kind of away from the family, now coming back to the family kind of things, and Hilo kind of the hothead like Sonny. I was loving making those comparisons, but I tell people though, just because you've seen The Godfather doesn't mean you know what happens in the book
Right.
at all. So you can see those influences, but I never once felt like it was being like derivative. And I think that's a fine line to walk, I would imagine,
It
as an
is.
author, because you got those influences and you want to make sure you're not just telling the same story again, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think every creative professional steals stuff left and right. That's what we do, is that we get inspired by other things. And what creativity is for me is taking all those inspirations and then making it something different. And you put it in the mixer and it comes out different, just because I had certain archetypes. The responsible eldest son, the hothead, the like black sheep of the family. Like those are archetypes that have come up in lots of stories, including The Godfather. But then what do I do with them to make them unique and fresh and their own thing? And that's the creative challenge. That's what makes it fun for me.
Well, I think you did a great job. So let's get into the viewer questions here. And I mean, it's the ones you're going to get the most. And I know you probably have this on, like speed dial right now to be able to do this. But here's the big ones here. What made you become a writer, and who influenced you the most in your writing career?
Oh gosh, that's why did I become a writer? It's kind of it's like very existential. I've always been a voracious reader, ever since a really young age, and fantasy and science fiction was always my go-to, just from the start. Prydain and Narnia, and then later Tolkien and Asimov, Bradbury, Mccaffrey. So that just for me, science fiction and fantasy was always where I could stretch my imagination the most. So that's what I loved growing up. And I was always just drawn to telling my own stories. That's what I'd do for fun. I'd write stuff on the bus. I'd be writing stories during biology class. So I just always thought of it as something that was a place of enjoyment for me, but I didn't really think of it in terms of a potential career until much later on. I went to college for something else. I had a 10-year career in business. And then I reached this point where I guess I've had a bit of a crisis when I realized I wasn't getting any time to write anymore because life had taken over. I had a job and family and all these other obligations. And I realized, hey, I'm not writing anymore. And writing was something that used to bring me so much joy. So how do I get back into it? And I'm at that point was like, well, I'm not getting younger. How do I like actually take myself seriously with this hobby? If I'm going to put time into it, I want to see how far I can get with it. And that's when I just seriously started thinking about getting published, getting better as a writer, and looking for an agent, going on submission, trying to get my work out there. So when I came back to writing, it was back into science fiction and fantasy from the start. And then in terms of like inspirations, I mean, obviously, all these authors that I enjoyed when I was a child were huge inspirations. And then I guess it's so hard because it's like who inspires you as a writer is it's a little harder to answer when you work in the field and so many of these current writers are your colleagues and you know them all because you're like, oh, these are all like friends of mine. But if I think of like who is a writer, a current writer that I just really admire, both from a craft standpoint, but also from a career standpoint, I'd go to Neil Gaiman. And the reason for that is because from a storytelling standpoint, Neil Gaiman is able to make the fantastic so relatable. Right? He brings it down to a level where it's like these are literal gods, that he writes about, and yet they feel so grounded in kind of the our world, sort of the textural minutia of our world. And the other thing that I just really I admire about his career is that he writes everything. You know, he's written novels, he's written comics, he's written scripts for. I mean, he's produced television shows, he's written books for kids, and across all this media, all these different things that he writes, he still has a very distinctive voice. It's always a Neil Gaiman story, and that's what I hope to have in my career in the long run, is writing a whole bunch of different stuff, different medium. I love writing science fiction and fantasy. I've written adult fiction, I've written YA fiction, I've written comics, and hopefully, you know, at the end of it all, being able to say I tried all these different things and they're all Fonda Lee stories. You know, that's kind of what I'd hope for.
Yeah, I love the Sandman. When I read the comic in high school, that completely like blew me away. You know, so yeah,
Mhm.
I'll always go to that one. Outside, that, I've only read Stardust, so I need to actually get into some more of his novels, I think. Now, you did mention a name that is a very, very big one for me. I love Ray Bradbury. I'm reading Fahrenheit 451 for like the third time right
Yeah.
now. So I think this is a good way to get into this next question. What are some of your favorite books of all time? And I'm not going to hold you to like any ranking or anything. Just, just off the top of your head, what are some of your go-tos?
Yeah, favorite books of all time. Um, you know, I'm not a big rereader.
Mm.
So I usually read a book once and then there's always new books to read.
Yeah.
So
I
I
need to
don't
get back to doing that.
yeah, so I don't really have comfort reads that I go back to over and over again. But I do have books that were really formative for me. And some of them, you know, I think especially the ones I read in like my teens, early 20s were really formative. And like some of them that come to mind for me were Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern series. And that was I think that one in particular had an impact on me because it blurred the line between science fiction and fantasy, where you start off and you think, oh, dragons, it's a fantasy novel. And then you get further on the series and you're like, oh, no, wait, no, wait, it's a science fiction novel. And she did something really cool with genre that stuck with me and that I think is reflected in how I approach my work. One my favorite series from early on is the Robot series by Asimov, and you know, the three laws of robotics and just the way like he set up that whole premise. I mean, that I remember reading that as a teenager, and that was really, I think, the series that got me um, made me fall in love with science fiction. And and like I think like, you know, there's also I'm of course there's like the Chronicles of Prydain, there's Lord of the Rings, you know, those The Never-Ending Story
Mm.
was one of my early favorites. So yeah, I mean there's a list, but I'm not much of a comfort reader. I'm always looking for kind of what's new, trying to stay abreast of.
Yeah, I keep saying I'm never gonna be able to read everything I want to before I die, and then I'll be like, "Hey, I'm gonna read this Stephen King book for the third time," you know. So I got to
Yeah,
get
yeah,
better at
yeah.
that. So if you could describe the premise of Green Bone Saga to everyone as a soon-to-be first-time reader to read your trilogy as you would, kind of like an elevator pitch, do you have one of those that you go to?
Well, I have described it as The Godfather with magic and kung fu. So, you know, maybe that sort of trickled back to you at some point. I've also described it as an epic urban fantasy, Asia-inspired, modern era gangster family saga. And I never get those words out all in the same order twice. Uh,
So I'll say that's
but
pretty good, yeah.
yeah, that pretty much sums it up. But it is I mean it is a when it came out, you know, one of the things that we struggled with, that both me and my publisher, you know, we had was a challenge for us, was how to describe it, how to sell it, because we didn't have a lot of comps. I mean, any comps really, because it is epic fantasy, but it's also urban fantasy and it's modern era. So it's going to, you know, it's going to have magic, but also guns and cars. And it's a fantasy story, but it's low magic. It's low fantasy in the sense that it's not giant world-ending good versus evil stakes. It is, at the end of the day, it's a story of these two clans, and in particular, one of the families that runs these clans. And you know, it's I think one of the things I'm often happy to hear is that people who say they don't even normally read fantasy picked it up and enjoyed it and got into fantasy. So for people who, and I've heard this many times from readers who said, "Hey, my dad or my wife or my brother doesn't really read fantasy, but I gave him Green Bone Saga and they really dug it." I like to think of myself as being a bit of a gateway drug.
Definitely, it could be a gateway
That's
series. I think so.
yeah, yeah. Especially for people who, they maybe their fantasy feels like, or fantasy, it conjures for them a certain idea of D&D campaign, or that kind of Northern European ancient history kind of milieu, medieval setting. And I like being the person who comes in is like, hey, no, here's another way you can think of fantasy.
I think so. Yeah, I just kind of like I said, only urban fantasy I've read is Jim Butcher, Dresden Files. So people are like, "Is that what you would classify it as?" I was like, I guess I don't know. I kind of stick with you. I'm like, it's the Godfather with in Japan with some magic and some sword fighting. What more do you really need, guys? And they're like, yeah, it's actually
Yeah,
sounds
I
good.
mean, sometimes these labels can be limiting, right? Because urban fantasy, often people immediately think it's like our world, but with hidden creatures.
Vampires. Yeah.
Yeah, vampires or werewolves. Um, and and so that isn't what this book is either. It's secondary world. So yeah, I mean, I at the end of the day, I write when I want to write, and leave it to other people to try and label it. But
Right. All right, so
yeah.
now we're getting into some of these writing ones here. What would you say are the fundamental components of a character that you need to know before you can write a full, complete arc for them?
Oh my gosh. I don't know everything about the character when I start writing them. I get to know the character through the process of writing them. And it's really interesting because when you start writing the draft, the characters feel pretty surface level, and that you're writing their dialogue, and a lot of the dialogue is pretty on the nose, and you're still trying to figure out who this person is. By the time you finish the draft, you know that character so much better. And you go back to the beginning of your manuscript and you're like, hey, wait, no,
Mm,
that's not what he would say at all.
mm.
And then you unearth more about this character, um, by putting them in these terrible situations. And then you see what happens. And that reveals more of their character. And you go through the revision process and hopefully keep polishing until that character is who they're meant to be. But one thing that I think is really important, just in general about characterization, is knowing that a character is always multifaceted, right? Individual, any one of us is has dimensions, right? Like we're not one person all the time. We are like a little different when we're with our spouse, or when we're with our kids, or when we're with our colleagues, right? So I always try to think of each character in terms of the fact that they are multifaceted. There's always more to them than just kind of their role in the story. So of course they have a role in the story, but just because they have kind of one defining characteristic, whether that's like the eldest brother, or the youngest sister, or the clan boss, or the villain, like that's not who they are in entirety. There's always more to them. And if I can tease out some of the complexity, I think that makes them just more interesting on the page. It makes them feel more like real people.
Excellent. I'm a character first guy, so I love hearing these kinds of things here. There's a nuclear explosion. Who has a better chance of surviving, Barrow or cockroaches?
I mean,
One of these things.
Barrow's probably somehow managed to make it into the bunker. I don't know how he's done it, but he's made it into that radiation shielded bunker with the
Hey,
cockroaches.
I like to call those
And
types
it's
of characters
alone in there.
fighters. Yeah. So, what, if any, were the inspirations for Hilo, Lan, and Shay?
I really started writing this series with just the premise. I didn't have any characters when I began. I just had the premise of the story. And I knew I wanted it to be centered around a family. And so I started thinking about, okay, well, who are the people in this family that I would play off of each other to create like the most interesting dynamics? So Hilo, Lon, and Shay each have kind of a different role in that family. And they started off kind of as sort of broad strokes archetypes, right? The responsible eldest brother, the sort of spoiled younger sister, and the like, volatile kind of middle child, right? And like these are very broad strokes archetypes. And then I put them into like this clan and this situation, and just dug into who they were and what their history was, and what kind of relationship they have. And of course, some of the influence came from The Godfather, right? Like with Michael going away and then coming back. You've got kind of the hot-headed character. But like I mixed them up, right? I didn't want them to be like one to one, be able to identify, oh, this character is like this. I just kind of took some of those ideas and some of these like family archetypes and then went from there.
Yeah, I like the one that I made the comparison of was Tom Hagen and Andy was the one that I come back to a lot. But I like that
Right, right.
basically one of my favorite subgenres is the coming of age story, and I feel like you do that with like four different characters, especially because of the how time kind of transpires over the course of the series. So yeah, more of those, and yeah, if you do that in your next series, I would really be in support of that. I just want to get that out there. So because Andon is a character I don't feel like anybody really talks about, but I like Andy a lot.
I think Andy has a pretty strong fan base.
Does he? Okay. Yeah. I mean, just all these questions are all about, those three. And no one's asking me anything about Andy. Come on, you guys. All right. So there is a major character death in book one. I'm not going to say who or what. What this person wants to know is, one, was that always the plan? And two, why?
I haven't forgiven myself for it either, in case it makes them feel any better. I knew from the start, it was planned right from the beginning. I knew that that would be kind of this cataclysmic moment that affected the entire rest of the series. So I, from the beginning, knew the fate of this character. And that made writing the character challenging, because I think what is super tragic about a character death is when you feel like the arc was cut short, right? Like there's those deaths that happen that feel like the natural conclusion of that character's narrative arc. What's really tragic, I mean, in both in real life as well as in fiction, is when this character had so much potential. There was so much more they could have done. They had plans. They could have succeeded. You saw how, like you can imagine what would have happened if this tragedy hadn't occurred. So that was the effect that I was going for. And my very first draft, I wrote it and I showed it to some early readers, and they said, well, that death was shocking, but it wasn't sad enough. And I went back and made sure that it was sad enough, because I knew I needed, in order for it to land, it had to really, you had to really be invested in that character and believe that they had a path forward. And the other characters had to really feel that loss, and for it to change absolutely everything.
Yeah, made me think of It by Stephen King. In case anyone hasn't read that, I won't say the character name, but he spends like 50 pages developing this character, and then at the end of that chapter, they commit suicide. And I'm like, oh my God, why did you just build up so much for this character to do that? So that's kind of what made me think of with this character. It's like, oh, well, she set up all this stuff, but I mean, I guess that's how life works. We don't get to finish everything, sometimes before we go, so that's just life. So yeah. Besides The Godfather, what other books or series were influential in writing the series? I think you kind of already answered that, didn't you? So, but if you had anything else, movies or I don't know, I guess you kind of already touched on them. So that's my fault. I already asked that question. Never mind.
No worries. I mean,
All
I
right.
will say, I think actually one film that had a lot of influence, not just on this work, but on my writing in general, was Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
Ah, yes, yes.
So that came out. I mean, I can't even remember now. It was a long time ago.
2000, because that was when I first learned about Michelle Yeoh and fell in love. Yeah.
Yes, right. So, I was younger then, but I had not really experienced that martial arts wuxia genre until Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon hit the screen. And I was just enamored.
Mhm.
And my dad was like, "Oh, you like that? Well, here's like this. There's an entire genre,
Yeah.
And so then I went down the rat hole of exploring this genre, and then there was like, there was so much else, Hero and Curse of the Golden Flower and House of Flying Daggers, and so much of it. But Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon it's kind of up there with The Matrix for me in terms of like the action, and like they were action movies, but action that I in a way that I hadn't seen before, and they didn't sacrifice anything in terms of kind of story and sort of deeper themes, even though there was like tons of sword fighting and cool stuff going on screen. So obviously it had an influence on what I write. And
that's great.
like the action scenes
Actually, I saw Everything Everywhere All at Once had Michelle Yeoh in it. And my wife was like, I never knew you were such a big Michelle Yeoh fan. I was like, it's ever since Crouching Tiger. And she's like, I've never seen him. Like, guess what we're doing tomorrow? Yeah. I had a hard time getting used to the low gravity fighting, but I was like, I don't know. I love this. All right. So I know you love this question. Do you have any other series in the works? And if so, can we assume it will remain in the urban fantasy/fantasy genre?
I do have other stuff in the works, and you cannot assume that it will remain in the urban fantasy genre. I am working on a science fiction project right now, so that will probably be my next one. I do have another fantasy series, but that will probably I have stories that I want to write, probably like booked out for the next 10 years.
Whoa,
it's just a matter of like figuring out when exactly I'm going to write them all. But a science fiction project, definitely another fantasy series that I want to do. And then I've got other stuff that I want to work on too. I want to write a horror novel at one point. So yeah, lots of other projects that I can't talk about yet. However, and some of them will be fantasy, but some of them will not.
Well, this is from me here. Would you be the type of writer that's like a Michael J. Sullivan or a Joe Abercrombie, where he writes the entire trilogy and then he moves on to the next thing? Or would you be like the Brandon Sanderson, who's, I'm going to write a book from this series, then a book from this series, then a book from this series, and then kind of just like rotate them around? Would you ever think about doing
that? I think I'm probably going to be more of the former, because once I get into a series and a story idea, I tend to stay there for a little while. The Green Bone Saga took up, something like 7 years. And that was my primary project while I was working on it. There was other stuff. I had another book that came out, I think, between Jade City and Jade War. There were short stories. But I really like series that end. So like for me, it's important to me that I plan it out and I know where it's going, and then I get there before I dive into the next thing. So there's been all these projects that I've backburnered because I was busy working on the Green Bone Saga, and now I can actually work on them.
All right. Well, hey, at least the tank isn't dry, so to speak. You've got lots of ideas there, so that's good. That's the first part, right? Having the idea. So at least I think so. This is about your magic system here. I think the magic is pretty unique in that it intersects innate ability with something that is a commodity. I'd like to know how you thought of that and how you decided to balance the use of magic in the series with the character, clan, and family stuff.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really love is when magic has economic implications. And the idea of Jade being this finite resource that is also valuable economically to the nation. That was just an area that I was really excited about exploring. And I could also use it as a stand-in for like many things in our own world, whether that be drugs or, weapons or money. And that it creates all these cool narrative constraints too, in terms of the inequitable distribution of this magic. Because if magic is limited and it's valuable, not everyone's going to have it, and that brings up all sorts of questions as to who gets it, who doesn't, how does it get distributed, who deserves it, who wants it. People like it brings in characters like Barrow who desperately want it but don't have the means or the ability to get it. So that's just something that I have always I coming from a business background and economics, the idea of magic having kind of all these real world implications is really appealing. And then also as a martial artist, I wanted the magic to feel limited in the sense that it doesn't just make you invincible. And like one of the things that often frustrates me in in fantasy fiction or just any fiction is when like martial arts is depicted as this thing where it's like, oh, this is someone who gets like some prodigious ability or some magic, and they train with the master for like a month, and then like kaboom, they're like immediately better.
Yeah.
But like, personally speaking, I know from experience that doesn't happen. Like it takes so long to become even like rudimentarily good at like the basics. So I wanted the magic abilities that are conferred in this world to come only through a lot of effort, and you have to be exposed at a young age. You have to go to these training academies. You have to work hard to build your tolerance to this jade and be able to use it, and for there to be consequences if you overdo it, right? And you wear too much. I've actually find there's just so many cool things that you can do with magic when you limit it and you make it feel kind of grounded and real. And then, of course, because there's this world where there is this magic substance, that implied all sorts of things about like the history of this place, like the development of its religion and how society was organized so that the warriors who could use it kind of ended up being a social caste of their own. And all the sayings, all the idioms, like the way people talk about it, the green being lucky, all the like little rituals that they have in their society because this thing exists, just unfolds all these world building possibilities. And I'm a world building junkie, so I'm always excited to kind of make it dive under the surface of like like you've got your magic, but then how does that ripple out and affect all the other stuff in that world and in the story?
Well, I can say, as someone who is a finance major and works in finance, I said she's taken some economic market growth behavior classes before. I can tell reading some of these passages, some of
You
these
had to
these
put it
world
to
building.
use somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So, the structure of the story in Jade's Legacy, the way it kind of jumps around, the frequent time jump stuff, is that something you had planned, or is that something that just came along as you were writing the series? Did you always plan to kind of fly through the years like that?
Yeah, it was definitely planned. So when I started off writing Jade City, I didn't know, first of all, whether it would sell, and then second of all, how many books it was going to be. So once I knew it was going to be a trilogy, and my publisher had agreed for it to be a trilogy, my goal was for this narrative to expand through kind of a deliberate scaffold. So Jade City is this story that is about two clans and their conflict on this one island. And then my intent with Jade War was to take that conflict and expand it internationally. So you get to see a lot more of the world. You see all these other countries. There's a lot more global players that are involved. And then with Jade Legacy, to take that story and turn it and make it an intergenerational one, so you see it expanding across time. So it was kind of like drawing a 3D cube, with Jade City being kind of one axis, and then Jade War being another axis, and then Jade Legacy being the third axis. So each book in that trilogy is meant to have a bit of a different flavor. And the challenge was to like, okay, make this one cohesive story, but for each of the three books to be a little bit different in tone. So I think if you like the sort of tighter, fast-paced clan warfare story, you like Jade City the most. If you like international, like world, like if you like big world building, international intrigue, you like Jade War the most. And if you're here for the family drama and the intergenerational story, you'll like Jade Legacy the most. And that's borne out. And I think it's been interesting. I've found that readers are pretty evenly split as to which of the three books they like the most.
Well, being the Godfather guy, obviously the first one was my favorite, but I'm also, like I said, such a big character guy. The third one really had a lot of stuff that I liked about it. But I was going to actually bring that up, is that it seems like a lot of modern fantasy trilogies, it does feel like one story just kind of split into three parts. I
Mm-hmm.
do feel like these do feel very, very different. They're very distinct. And that's It's actually quite impressive that you're able to pull that off. But I do have a non-Green Bone question for you. Will we ever see a book 3 in the Exo series?
Oh gosh. Probably not, because it was planned and sold as a duology, and I'm like now so many years past that duology that I doubt I'll be able to go back and write the third one. I do get that question once in a while, because I really am fond of that duology. But too many books, not enough time.
Yeah, yeah, I get that. All right, so if I don't ask about the TV stuff, people are going to jump all over me here. So, I mean, personally, I was saddened to hear about the adaptation with Peacock getting canceled. Is there any interest from other parties that you can speak on? And there's probably a lot of things you're usually not allowed to speak on these things, but is there?
Yeah, and I can't give specifics. I can say there is other
There
interest,
is other interest.
and we are in conversations. It's a weird time for TV adaptations. It the streaming landscape is kind of a Hunger Games situation right now because we're in the situation where um, everyone jumped into the streaming wars, and Netflix is canceling stuff, and HBO Max is merged with Discovery, and they're canceling everything, and so it's kind of a rough time in the streaming service world. So we're definitely investigating the different avenues, and fingers crossed. When I can share stuff, I certainly will.
Okay, I just hope it's not like the CW or something because this needs to be R-rated, you guys. Okay.
That's right. No,
So dream casting, you're allowed to cast anyone as any character. If you could do that, what would be a dream casting for any character in your story?
oh gosh, I don't know. At one point I did know, and I think I put it up at various times in different AMAs on Reddit and stuff. But now I've seen so many different fan casts
Yeah. Mm.
that it's completely muddled. Why? Because people have put together great fan casts. So I don't feel like I have a dream casting anymore. But I will encourage you to go onto the internet and look up some of the fan casts, because there's some pretty good ones out there.
Okay, well, I apologize for this question in advance, but I did get it at least a dozen times, so I feel like I have to ask it. Do you read any Harlequin romance or erotica because your sex scenes are really spicy?
I do not. I do not. I'll take that as a compliment. I'm very flattered to get a shout out for the spiciness of my sex scenes. No, I treat writing sex scenes a lot like the way I treat writing action scenes. I think there's a lot of overlap in the skill that's required to write an action scene and write a sex scene, because they are both highly physical confrontations between two emotional parties. So there's sort of similar principles in writing them both, like clarity, knowing where all the body parts are, not getting too overly flowery with language, but making sure everything is like clear and the emotional stakes are well communicated on the page, and that there's repercussions out of whatever happens. So no, but I the way I view it is, I don't fade to black when there's going to be a fight scene, so I don't fade to black when there's going to be a sex scene either. Just put them both on the page.
I'll say there was one in Jade where my wife and I were on a cruise, and I was reading one where we were on that one, and I was just like, I'm going to read some because she reads a lot of Harlequin romance novels, and I actually like read out to her, like she's like, that's actually pretty good. Like you can go ahead and add this to my Kindle. So yeah, she was impressed. Okay, so
I'm glad to hear that.
where did the Jade concept come from? I really do like the addiction aspect of it. It's my favorite part of the magic system.
So the Jade concept came somewhat out of a sense of wish fulfillment, because, like I said, I'd watched all these martial arts movies like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and I was like, I've trained for a long time and I cannot run up brick walls. That is just false advertising. I'm very, very disappointed. I cannot do chi blasts. So obviously the fantasy writer in me thought, okay, well, there has to be a X factor here. There has to be some magic reason why these martial artists can do all this stuff. And Jade, fantasy element or minerals and weapons and crystals are like nothing new, right? There's tons of them in fantasy fiction. But in Eastern tradition, jade was always considered the most valuable substance, like more valuable than diamonds or gold. Jade was considered like a connection between earth and heaven, and had a lot of spiritual significance, obviously a lot of economic significance. And I thought, well, I'll just make jade literally magic, and it went from there.
Yeah, I think I was impressed. It almost was like almost like oil or something, like a valuable resource or anything. That was like a really nice twist. But I also, yeah, like the addiction part of it too, and the people that could have ways to use it when they didn't really have the natural gifts for it and stuff. It's really neat. And I'm glad that you didn't kind of go overboard with it, because one thing I say is, myself personally, I'm not crazy about hard magic systems. I think there's just the magic's a character. It's neat. Like Brandon Sanderson's great at it. He's great at it. But I was like, when I have to look at like a cheat sheet to understand what your magic's doing right now, I don't know personally if that's just me. I love low magic systems, so I think it's great. So I do have a writer question here from an aspiring author. I'm always interested in a writer's craft. Do you set a schedule and treat it like a 9 to 5 job? Do you have a set routine, or you just kind of write when inspiration strikes? And do you revise constantly, or write an entire draft and then revise?
Oh, I wish I had the answer to any of those questions, because I don't have a set routine. I've written, what is it now? 7 books, and I still feel like I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants with everyone. Everyone is a little bit different and kind of demands a little different process. But I do treat it like a job insofar as I have certain deadlines that I set, either that my publisher sets or that I set for myself. So in order for me to write books on anything resembling a productive schedule, I have to say things like, I'm going to finish this chapter this week, or I'm going to have a first draft done by Christmas. And then I'll work backwards from that, and I'll figure out, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of my schedule? And, oh, I have to make sure I block off this week entirely because I'm traveling, or I'm, going to a con or what have you. So that then dictates kind of how much I've got to make sure I write each day. But I am not a hard and fast word count person. And I also don't write every day. There's advice you'll hear out there: write every day, or write this many words per day, or fast first draft. And I don't really ascribe to any of them. I think you kind of have to figure out what works for you. I'm not a super fast writer. I usually write between like 1 and 2,000 words a day when I'm drafting. And I tend to be a slow first drafter, but then a fast reviser. And I will sometimes revise as I go. Not every day, but sometimes I will write a certain amount and realize, oh, this isn't working, or like this has kind of gone off the rails a little bit, and I'll backtrack and I'll figure out where I need to pick up the thread and do some revision to get back to where I need to go.
Yeah, in Stephen King's autobiography on writing, he said that when he's in first draft mode, he just tells himself, write 6 pages per day. Do you think that's psychotic?
That sounds psychotic to me. I mean, I don't know how many pages. Let's see how many pages.
Well, his books average about 600, 700 pages.
Yeah, I mean, like each page is like maybe 250, 300 words. So if he's writing like a couple thousand words a day, that's doable. I mean, that's very productive. Stephen King is a very productive writer. I'd like to get
as I've got a whole entire bookcase of all this stuff. Yeah. I've wondered more about the past and the Mountain Clan. Any plans on possibility of making a prequel? Let me kind of wrap this into one here. Do you have any plans of visiting this universe again outside of Jade Setter, which I haven't got to yet, but I do have it on my Kindle?
So Jade Setter came out. That was a really fun way for me to do another foray into this world, and in a standalone manner that could be either enjoyed before you read the series or after you read the series. There's a short story collection that's also coming out from Subterranean Press next summer. Nice. And then that's it. So I don't have plans to revisit the world at this point, because I've got too many other projects.
We've got lots of ideas for prequels for you, like the events of trilogy from the Mountains point of view is one that I get a lot that people want to
yeah. And I like to imagine. The thing is, like, the way I wrote the Mountain Clan, I like to think that I I wrote them in a way that you could tell this entire story from the Mountain Clan's point of view and be equally sympathetic to them. Um, and there's so much backstory there with the previous generation and the Many Nations War. I had a lot of fun creating all the little historical interludes that went into the series. So the way that it's structurally set up is that there's these little interludes in Jade City that are kind of ancient myth. And then the interludes in Jade War are like ancient history. So there's mention of like the Warring Sisters era, the Three Crowns era, and like things that led up through the history of Kekon. And then the interludes in Jade Legacy are more recent history. So the previous generation of like the Many Nations War and Kalsen and Ayugantin and like the predecessors. So the interludes end up catching up. The interludes that happen throughout the series end up catching up back to the beginning of Jade City. So there's all this stuff that I created, these little like interludes that I can imagine like blowing up into big stories. But the reality is, as a writer, that like you could just continue to keep playing in the same sandbox over and over and again to diminishing returns because
all those other ideas. Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd
Yeah.
be rough.
So
Because I mean, personally, I was so intrigued by 8 Mata. I would love to see more stuff on her. So yeah. So if you're ever bored and you decide, hey, here's a short story, I'll give you my email. So I'm in awe of how you write action sequences. They never feel too long and every word feels purposeful. My question is, how do you approach those scenes and whether or not you find action harder to write than the political discussions within the series?
I find action easier to write. And maybe it is because that I just enjoy them, or I have some background in martial arts and I'm an action movie fan, that I treat them kind of like candy. When I know there's an action scene coming up, I'm like, oh, all right, I can get through this heavy political chapter because I know there's going to be some whoop-ass
Every
there.
time someone says I offer you a clean blade, I'm like, yeah. I say that around the house now. My wife's like, what are you even talking about? I was like,
well, what's the most clean blade worthy thing that has happened to you that you've had to offer a clean blade?
But my kids didn't, clear the table after they finished eating. That's pretty much it. That's what's like. We got young kids. I'd love to know what kind of research you put into creating the culture and history of Xianlun.
So when I created Xianlun, I wanted it to feel very recognizable to our own world, but also completely like its own place. And that was a tricky balancing act because I wanted to clearly signal that it was a modern day Asian metropolis. And so as a result, I took a lot of inspiration from cities like Hong Kong, Singapore, Taipei, Tokyo. I like printed out maps of those cities and studied them. I looked at old photographs of those cities and like I kind of dug into research also just about like the history of a lot of these places. For example, the American presence in Okinawa informed like Yuan Naval Base in Kekon, but also this is a fictional world. And so I didn't want anyone to be like, oh, well, this is just clearly fake Hong Kong or, fake Tokyo or whatever. So I was very deliberate about making sure that like I looked at these other cities for inspiration, but that I didn't copy them. And that Xianlun still felt like its own place. And I also took other little snippets of inspiration here and there. So like the subway system in Xianlun, for example, is the subway system of Toronto because I lived there for many years and became very familiar with the subway system. So that's how that happened. But I wanted to kind of evoke all the sort of textural details that you would be like, oh yeah, when that reminds me of a place in real life, but it's also completely different because the way that it's run and the Jade and the clans and making sure that I was never too specific with like the words that I used and created my own cars and restaurants and city districts and names for stuff. Hopefully give Xianlun the sense of specificity and also like this feeling that it's real. Like I just wanted people to feel like, hey, I can get on a plane, I can go to John Loon, I can walk into the Twice Lucky, can order some crispy squid
Yeah, but
balls.
you might walk into Barrow, so I wouldn't recommend that. It's dangerous. So a couple of writer questions here to end this. How hard was it for you to get published? Do you have any stories about like the mountain of rejection letters or anything like that?
So my publication journey was pretty sort of steady and straightforward
Oh,
in the sense that I wrote a novel that I queried and that didn't sell. Then I wrote another novel and got an agent and sold that to a relatively small press for a relatively small advance. And then I wrote another novel and then I got a bigger advance for 2 books. And then I wrote Jade City, and that became this 3 book, series that has probably, I would say, has been my most well known and
mhm.
most popular work so far. So it's definitely had. I mean, any writer has their war stories, being in the query trenches and trying to get published, and there's just, you never know how long it'll take. I know writers who just hit it out of the gate and sold like their first work, the first book that they wrote. I know others that wrote 10 books before their first one got published, and then some of their backlist, the ones that they trunked, ended up being published later. Yeah, you don't know. It is in many ways a crapshoot, and there's a huge amount of luck. So Jade City actually was very much a case of finding the right editor at the right house at the right time, because I had finished the manuscript, I had sent it to my editor, and I mean sent it to my agent, and my editor actually tweeted out a like hashtag manuscript wish list tweet, asking for a Game of Thrones esque fantasy, but set in like 1930s Asia with like gang families and magic.
Okay.
And that just absolutely out of the blue, something that fit the description of what I just finished writing. And so we sent it to her, and the rest is history. So there's a lot of luck involved, and there's absolutely a ton of rejection. You get used to rejection as a writer, because it's not it's not you, it's not personal. It's often
Sure.
like finding the right match, right? It's in a way, it's like, I don't know, finding the right editor for your work in the right house. It's almost like dating. Like you got to find like the person who's got the same vision for this work as you do.
We make the joke, us lowly reviewers, these independent reviewers, as we like to call ourselves, about how every single blurb these days say it's Game of Thrones meets blank or whatever. So, I mean, it sounds like publishers are looking for this, right? I mean, they're saying, hey, give me a Game of Thrones meets blank. Would you say that that's accurate?
So comps are a thing for sure, and they are a double-edged sword because they're absolutely used by both publishers and by writers, um, as a shorthand, because it's very hard to explain your book in an elevator pitch. Right? We get asked to do it over and over again, so it is sometimes convenient to be able to like pull something that is like snappy and quick, and this meets this. But unfortunately, they get so overused. I mean, I'm sure you've seen this too, right? Where it's like, oh gosh, this is yet another book that's being comped to Game of Thrones. Like, come
Yeah.
on, right? And especially when something gets big and popular, like Game of Thrones, you'll just see comp after comp being, using the same touch point. And so I get it. I know why they're used, but they have their downsides, and they may also shut people off from taking a chance on stuff, because, like, for example, you mentioned that you'd heard the Godfather, the Jade City described as the Godfather with magic, but there's plenty of people who don't enjoy crime drama fiction, or who've never watched The Godfather, or who could care less about Francis Ford Coppola's
I mean,
masterpiece.
I don't call those people, but you're correct. They do exist.
Right, right. So, those people may be turned off of it and not give it a
Yeah.
chance. And lots of people have said, "Hey, I didn't pick up the book initially because I heard it was like a gangster story. I'm not really into gangs." But it's not. It's like this isn't sort of a story about criminals. It is a fantasy story about these clans. So yeah, they're useful, but I always try to go beyond them too. And like I always appreciate when reviewers do that, when they say, "Hey, I've heard this pitched as this, but I'm going to take the time to go deeper into it and tell you more about like why you should read it." And hopefully, that, I mean, that's why word of mouth is just so important, is because it conveys much more than whatever little blurb, someone can give you in a minute or two.
Absolutely. One last question from an aspiring writer. How do you work on your writing craft? As someone who is not from a literature background, do you think just reading and writing is enough to improve your skills to a publishable level?
No. But I will caveat this and say you don't need a formal education. So if you are out there and you're an aspiring writer and you think, oh gosh, I don't have an MFA, don't let that hold you back. I certainly did not have any formal education in creative writing, and many, many successful authors do not. Can you go out and get education, create it yourself? Absolutely. There's writing workshops, there's conferences, there's classes. There's so many ways to educate yourself and improve your craft. But you do have to go beyond just reading a lot and writing a lot. Like absolutely read a lot, absolutely write a lot. But you also need feedback. That's really, really crucial, is you need other people to read your work and respond to it. And so that means finding other writers, potentially a critique group, or like submitting your work and starting to get rejected. And you realize, and then you get, if you start getting personalized rejection saying, hey, like I really like this, but you didn't nail the ending, that's important feedback for you. So that's the advice I would give, is that no, you don't need a formal education, but you do need to find ways to educate yourself and to get outside opinions on your work.
Great, great. Yeah, see me, I'm like, yeah, all this rejection sounds like a lot. So that's easy to see why I never became a writer. But no, these makes great points. I mean, I think if you have like a built-in alpha reader at home, if like your spouse or something, I think that's probably a great measuring stick. Or your kids, because if they're like my kids, they have no problem telling you the truth, no matter how much it hurts. So yeah, that's
Yeah, sometimes it can be really, it depends, because I know writers who have spouses or significant others who give them really like in-depth actual like craft related feedback. But it can also be really great to just have a cheerleader, somebody who will read your stuff and say like, no, I like this, keep going, someone who'll motivate you. So that can be an important
very important.
goal as well.
Before I let you go, you mentioned something earlier about horror. I wasn't sure that you were into horror. So now you're saying that you are. I do this thing in October called spooky season, where it's just everything is like a horror theme, because horror is kind of a niche thing on the booktube here, but I love it. I love horror. I think just growing up as a Stephen King reader, I just became really attached to horror. So if you said that you had like some horror influences, books maybe that really kind of left a lasting impression, can you think of anything?
Hmm. I don't know. I don't say I have any like ones that immediately like have influenced me specifically in my work yet. But I have a couple of recommendations
Sure.
for I actually one of them that I read recently and I really enjoyed was A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. So if you haven't read that, I'll add that one to your TBR. And then one that is, I don't know if I would call it's literary horror, but I think of it as a horror novel. And it's We Need to Talk About Kevin.
Uh,
Um,
okay.
and
I
I
get that
can't.
recommended a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it was. I can't remember the author off the top of my head,
Mm.
but yeah, both of those.
Yeah, I've been trying to find some good modern horror author because I realized all I was doing was just like reading like Stephen King or Clive Barker, just stuff that was like really old. And I was like, I need to get some more modern horror authors. So I'm kind of trying to dig into that a little bit this year. So appreciate the recommendations. That's the list that just kind of gets longer. And it's almost as long as Jade Legacy, my list of books I noticed they'd get bigger. They got bigger each book. Was that planned or is
Bigger. Yeah. I mean, I think just by the nature of like the story
yeah.
expanding, they did get bigger.
Hey, I'm
So
I'm proud of you though, because a lot of authors will be like, you know what, this is getting too big. I'm just gonna go ahead and make this 4 books now. That seems
yeah,
like
no, I was very determined to not do that, avoid that. And then after I Jade Legacy, I was like, okay, I'm going short again. So I did Jade Setter, which is a very trim
yeah,
little under 40,000 word novella.
yeah. Just something you just kind of wrote on a notepad one day, right? No big
I wish it was that easy. I remember thinking, oh, novella, this is gonna be a breeze. What is this, like 8 chapters? No, you have to tell a whole story in that time. So it's harder than it seems at first glance.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Very, very fun conversation for me. I hope it hasn't been miserable for you. I'm very excited to see what you do next. And nice you told me that it is something science fiction related. I'll just say I prefer space opera, so I hope maybe it's something like that. So
Well, I wouldn't. It's not. I wouldn't describe it as space opera, but definitely a space opera elements
hmm.
vibe to it.
Well, you're an Asimov fan, so I believe in you. So, all right, well, thank you so much, and like I said, I look forward to whatever comes next.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.